Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
You got it. We're back diving in, and I'm Pi.
I'm Nick, and today we are tackling a really interesting topic, one that's been making headlines and causing some, well, let's be honest, a little bit of concern out there.
Definitely some concern. We're talking about tariffs.
Tariffs, yeah.
Mm.
On the surface, they sound simple enough, taxes on imports, right? But as we dig deeper, we'll see it's a whole lot more complex than that.
Oh, way more complex for sure.
So, to really get a handle on this, we've gathered insights from a whole range of sources.
A range of perspectives is always key, isn't it?
Absolutely. We've got in-depth YouTube analyses from folks like Sean Fu and Patrick Boyle.
Those guys always have interesting takes.
And we'll also hear from the team at Money and Macro, who delves into some really fascinating big picture stuff.
Oh yeah, Money and Macro, they love those big picture analyses.
Then we'll check out a Fox Business interview with White House advisor Steve Marin.
Straight from the source, potentially, right? Exactly, and we'll round things out with a breakdown from Clear Value Tax, just to make sure we're all on the same page about the nuts and bolts of tariffs.
The nuts and bolts are always important.
So our mission today is to unpack the goals behind these tariffs. What are they really trying to achieve?
My goals and motivations.
And we'll focus particularly on the U.S.-China trade relationship, which seems to be the epicenter of a lot of these tariff tensions.
That's the big one, isn't it? U.S.-China.
Yeah, but we also want to zoom out a bit.
Zoom out.
Yeah, to look beyond those immediate headlines and explore some of the potential ripple effects, the unexpected consequences, the larger global shifts that might be on the horizon.
The butterfly effect of tariffs, so to speak.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's jump into Sean Fu's analysis. He presents a pretty strong argument, almost framing the current situation as an economic war.
Oh, wow. Economic war.
Yeah.
That's serious.
It is. And in his view, this was initiated by U.S. tariffs, which then triggered China's pretty significant response, a 34% tariff on U.S. goods back in April.
34%. That's a big hit back.
It is. And what Fu finds really interesting is how China reacted.
What stood out to him?
Well, he sees a real shift in their approach. They didn't just mirror the U.S. tariffs. It was much more aggressive, more strategic.
More like a counteroffensive then.
Exactly. So Fu details this multi-pronged response from China. They've got that hefty 34% tariff, but they're also restricting the export of 7 types of rare earth minerals.
Rare earth minerals. Why are those so important?
They're crucial for all sorts of modern technologies.
Like what?
Smartphones, electric vehicles, advanced weaponry, you name it.
So cutting off those exports, that's a big strategic move.
Huge. And it doesn't stop there. Fu points out that China has blacklisted 11 U.S. defense companies and imposed export controls on 16 U.S. firms.
They're definitely hitting back strategically, aren't they?
Absolutely. They're targeting key sectors.
Huh.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, Fu interprets China's strategy as a calculated bet.
A bet. On what?
He thinks they believe the U.S. economy is actually more reliant on them than the other way around.
That's a bold assumption.
It is. And he even raises the possibility of China selling off its holdings of U.S. assets, like treasury bonds.
Wow, that would be a huge shock to the global financial system.
No doubt. Now, this all raises an important question for everyone listening. What does this mean for you, for your everyday life?
Right, that's what we all want to know. How does this hit our wallets?
Well, Fu suggests we could see higher prices for a lot of the things we buy as these tariffs and restrictions work their way through those global supply chains.
So our morning coffee might get a bit pricier?
Potentially, yeah. And there's also the possibility of Chinese consumers shifting their buying habits.
How so?
Well, if they start seeing U.S. goods as less desirable because of all this trade tension, that could really hurt American businesses that depend on that Chinese market.
That makes sense. It's all about perception, too.
Exactly. And Fu gives some concrete examples. Take agriculture, for instance.
Food prices are always a sensitive topic.
For sure. So China needs things like soybeans, wheat, and dairy, right?
Of course, staples.
And Fu points out they could easily get those from other countries, like Russia or Brazil.
So American farmers lose out.
Potentially, yeah. And then there's a huge industry like aviation, where China represents something like 20% of global demand for airplanes.
That's massive.
It is. So imagine if they decided to favor Airbus or their own domestic production over Boeing.
That would be a devastating blow to the American aerospace industry.
Absolutely. Now, what's interesting is that Fu cautions against an immediate tit-for-tat retaliation from the U.S.
He doesn't want to escalate things.
Exactly. He's worried about a full-blown trade war, which, as history shows, rarely has any real winners.
Everyone loses in a trade war.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
But he does bring up a thought-provoking point.
What's that?
He suggests that countries with trade deficits, like the
We
U.S.,
import more than we export, right?
right. He suggests those countries might actually have a bit of an advantage in these kinds of disputes.
An advantage. How so?
The logic is that countries with trade surpluses, those that export more, are more dependent on those exports for their economic growth.
So they have more to lose, potentially.
Exactly. Now, as we mentioned earlier, China's targeting of rare earth minerals adds another layer of complexity here.
Those are pretty key materials, right?
They are. They're not just any old commodities. They're absolutely essential for all sorts of cutting-edge industries, from high-tech manufacturing to green energy technologies, and importantly, for defense systems.
So controlling those resources gives them a lot of leverage.
A lot, yeah. And just to give you some specific examples, we're talking about things like savium, terbium, and lutetium.
Names I've never heard of, but I guess they're important.
They are, trust me. And by restricting access to them, China could gain a significant advantage in these rapidly growing sectors.
It's like holding the keys to the future, in a way.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And Fu even outlines some potential escalations down the line.
What kind of escalation?
Even higher tariffs, bans on crucial technologies. He specifically mentions NVIDIA chips. Those are vital for AI development.
Oh, wow. Blocking off those chips would be a huge problem.
It would, yeah. And then, in a worst-case scenario, he even mentions the possibility of U.S. dollar sanctions.
U.S. dollar sanctions? That sounds almost unimaginable.
It would be a major escalation for sure. Now, going back to those rare earth restrictions, their impact goes way beyond just those big headline-grabbing industries.
What else do they affect?
Oh, all sorts of things. Medical devices, electronics, even everyday materials like aluminum.
Aluminum? Really?
Yeah, it turns out that restrictions on scandium, another one of those rare earth elements, can make those lightweight aluminum alloys more expensive.
So the ripple effects are everywhere.
Absolutely. You can see just how interconnected the global economy really is.
Makes you think twice about that made in label, right?
It does, yeah. And remember that concern about China selling off U.S. dollar assets? Well, it's not just a theory.
It's actually happening.
Fu points out that foreign holdings of U.S. debt have been declining for a while now.
So they're already pulling back a bit.
They are, and this kind of action could really accelerate that trend, potentially weakening the dollar even more.
That's not good for our economy.
Not ideal, no. Now, it's worth noting how the markets have been reacting to all of this.
They usually have a pretty good sense of where things are headed.
They do, and Fu points to a downturn in the S&P 500, a bear market in the tech sector, and increased expectations for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates.
All signs of nervousness about the economy.
Definitely. And it all seems to be tied to these escalating trade tensions.
So the markets are taking this very seriously.
Very seriously, yeah. Now, Fu's concluding thought is pretty stark. He believes we're witnessing the end of globalization, as we've noted.
The end of globalization. Wow.
Yeah, he thinks the U.S. and China are both likely to become more protectionist.
More focused on protecting their own industries.
Exactly, and he thinks this is driven, at least in part, by the U.S. accumulating so much debt under that previous globalized model.
So a retreat inwards.
In a way, yeah. And to add to the concern, he points out that J.P. Morgan has increased their odds of a global recession.
A global recession. That's scary stuff.
It is. So Fu paints a pretty intense picture, highlighting a significant escalation in trade tensions and the possibility of some long-term consequences.
Definitely a lot to think about there. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at Patrick Boyle's analysis of Trump's reciprocal tariffs.
Right, reciprocal tariffs. So Boyle starts off by discussing what he calls Trump's Liberation Day announcement.
Liberation Day. Sounds ironic.
It does, considering the market reaction. It was decidedly negative.
So not much liberation going on.
Not really, no. Now, what Boyle really wants to make clear right off the bat is who actually pays these tariffs.
Who foots the bill, so to speak?
Exactly. He stresses that it's the importing companies and individuals within the country imposing the tariff.
So not the foreign countries.
Not directly, no. It's the folks bringing those goods into the country.
That's an important distinction.
It is. So when we talk about a tariff on Chinese goods, it's often American companies paying that tax when they import those goods.
So that cost gets passed down to us, the consumers.
Most likely, yeah. Now, Boyle then breaks down the specific tariff rates under this plan.
Give some numbers.
Okay, so we're talking about 34% on goods from China, 27% from India, 24% from Japan, 20% from the EU, and then a blanket 10% on most other countries.
That's a lot of tariffs.
It is, and it gets even more complicated because that 10% is on top of any existing tariffs.
So it's adding up.
It adds up, yeah. Some goods, especially those from China, could be hit with a total tariff of 65%.
65%. Wow, that would have a massive impact on prices.
No doubt. And the immediate market fallout that Boyle observed mirrored some of the concerns that Fu brought up.
What did he see happening?
Well, he noted big drops in the S&P 500 and NASDAQ, declines in major stocks like Dell and Apple, and hits to the retail, apparel, and banking sectors.
Ouch, those are some big names.
They are. We also saw the dollar falling, treasury yields dropping, and oil prices decreasing.
All signs of a shaky economy.
Basically, yeah. It all seems to point towards lower expectations for U.S. economic growth.
Not a good look.
Not great, no. Now, Boyle then brings in the analysis of James Sawicki, a journalist who pointed out a potential problem with how the Trump administration was calculating these foreign tariff levels.
A problem? What kind of problem?
Well, Sawicki argued that they were just dividing the trade deficit with a country by the total value of U.S. imports from that country.
That doesn't sound very sophisticated.
It's not a standard way to calculate reciprocal tariff levels.
So the very basis for some of these tariffs might be flawed.
That's what Sawicki is suggesting, yeah.
Yeah?
And Boyle points out that the White House's defense of their methodology wasn't very convincing.
So the math might be a bit fuzzy.
Maybe, yeah. And then there's the rather strange list of targeted entities.
Strange how?
Well, beyond the usual suspects, the big trading partners, the list reportedly included Taiwan and even uninhabited islands like Heard Island and McDonald Islands.
Uninhabited islands. What are they importing from there?
Penguins, apparently.
Penguins, you're kidding, right?
Nope. Boyle even jokes about penguins facing a 10% tariff.
That's hilarious. But it does make you wonder about the thought process behind this list.
It does, yeah. And there was even some speculation online, which Boyle mentions, about whether AI might have been involved in generating such an odd assortment.
AI gone rogue.
Uh-huh.
Maybe not, but it's funny to think about.
It is, yeah. And this whole thing highlights the potential for unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, Boyle gives examples of small economies that could be disproportionately affected by these broad tariffs.
Small economies, big impact.
Right. He mentions Lodo, a kingdom that relies heavily on denim manufacturing. They're facing a 50% tariff.
50%. That's huge for a small country.
It is. And then there are the Fallen Islers, known for their Patagonian toothfish exports. They're facing a 41% tariff, even though they barely export anything to the U.S.
That just seems unfair.
It does, yeah. And Madagascar, with its vanilla bean exports, they're hit with a 47% tariff.
So a blanket approach can really miss the nuances, can it?
Absolutely. It underscores how these seemingly indiscriminate tariffs can have some really damaging effects on smaller players in the global economy.
Like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Kind of, yeah. Now, Boyle does note that Canada and Mexico might get a bit of a pass under the USMCA agreement.
The new NAFTA.
Right, yeah. It suggests that maybe there's some recognition of how interconnected those trading relationships are.
Makes sense, they're our neighbors.
For sure. Now, Boyle then shifts gears and addresses the main argument in favor of tariffs.
What's the pro-tariff side saying?
Well, the big one is protecting U.S. manufacturing and jobs, especially after the decline we've seen since the 1970s.
Bringing back those factory jobs.
Exactly. And he contrasts Trump's tariff-heavy approach with Biden's strategy of using subsidies to encourage domestic production.
So two different paths to the same goal.
Kind of, yeah. Now, here's the thing. Boyle is skeptical about whether those high tariffs will actually work.
He doubts their effectiveness.
He does. He's worried they could hurt American companies that rely on global supply chains. Companies like Apple and Nike.
Those are global giants.
They are, yeah. And those high tariffs could make them less competitive compared to international rivals like Samsung.
So it could backfire.
Potentially, yeah. He also brings up James Scott's argument that the kind of manufacturing comeback Trump envisions might not even be possible anymore.
Why not?
Because of automation.
Ah, robots taking over.
Right. So even if those tariffs brought manufacturing back, it might not create all that many jobs.
So the whole premise might be outdated.
Maybe. Now, some folks, like Basant and Aman, have suggested that these tariffs are more about negotiation.
A bargaining chip.
Kind of, yeah. But Boyle's not buying it.
What?
He points to those flawed calculation methods and the randomness of some of the rates and targeted entities.
It doesn't seem like a coherent strategy.
It doesn't, no. And then there are Trump's other stated goals, like achieving balanced trade, where imports and exports are equal.
That sounds like a tall order.
It is, and most economists think it's unrealistic. He's also talked about stopping fentanyl and raising revenue for tax cuts.
Multiple motivations, maybe.
Could be, yeah. Now, Boyle also presents a counterpoint to that pro-manufacturing argument often made by folks like J.D. Vance.
What's the counterargument?
Well, he points out that a lot of Americans like those affordable imported goods.
Cheap clothes, electronics, all that.
Right, yeah. And he reminds us that we've got a lot of unfilled job vacancies right now.
So the problem might not just be a lack of jobs.
Exactly. Now, Boyle then outlines some potential downsides to this whole protectionist approach.
What are the risks?
Well, one big one is that reduced competition can lead to less innovation.
Companies get complacent.
Right. He uses Argentina as an example of how that can play out.
Not a good example.
Not really, no. And then there's the logistical headache of managing all these tariffs.
It's a bureaucratic nightmare.
It is, yeah. And Boyle even brings up a historical example, William McKinley.
The president.
Yeah. He initially raised tariffs, but ended up advocating for cuts because they led to inflation and hurt the Republicans politically.
So history might be repeating itself.
Potentially, yeah. So, in the end, Boyle sees a lot of uncertainty around Trump's tariff plans.
He's not convinced.
Not really, no. And he points out that even just the announcements are having a negative impact on business and consumer confidence.
Uncertainty breeds fear.
For sure. And then there's the potential for global repercussions, like China retaliating with their own tariffs and concerns from European countries.
It's a global web of interconnectedness.
It is. So Boyle paints a picture of some potentially damaging and maybe even poorly thought out tariff policies with a high risk of unintended consequences.
Not a very optimistic outlook.
Not particularly, no. But now let's hear from someone who's been advising on these policies. Steve Marin in his Fox Business interview.
Getting the inside scoop.
Exactly. So Marin, as a White House advisor, naturally emphasizes the fairness angle.
Fairness for America.
Right. He starts by clarifying that the 10% baseline tariff is just a minimum.
A minimum. So it could go higher.
It could, yeah, depending on how the other country treats U.S. exports.
Tit for tat.
Exactly. So if another country has higher tariffs on our goods, we'll match them or even exceed them.
That's the reciprocal part.
Right. And Marin specifically talks about preventing transshipment.
Transshipment. What's that?
It's when companies route goods through third countries to avoid tariffs.
Sneaky?
It is, yeah. And Marin argues that these reciprocal tariffs are meant to close those loopholes.
So it's all about fairness and playing by the rules.
That's the argument, yeah. Now, when Kudlow, the interviewer, brings up Mexico and Canada under the USMCA.
Those are our NAFTA buddies.
Right, yeah. Marin suggests they might be exempt from these new tariffs if they're sticking to the terms of that trade deal.
Special treatment for our neighbors.
It seems that way, yeah. But he admits he's not a trade law expert, so the details are still a bit fuzzy.
Always good to have an expert on hand.
For sure. Now, a big point Marin emphasizes is the revenue these tariffs could generate.
How much are we talking?
He estimates around $500 billion annually.
$500 billion. That's a lot of money.
It is, and Kudlow is clearly excited about it, talking about using that money for tax cuts for American farmers and businesses.
So they see it as a way to offset any negative impacts of the tariff.
Exactly. Marin also talks about how the U.S. dollar might actually strengthen because of these tariffs.
Strengthen. Why would that happen?
Well, he says it's because we'd have lower trade deficits if we're importing less.
So less demand for foreign goods means a stronger dollar.
In theory, yeah. He also suggests this could help with inflation, but he acknowledges that other economic factors are involved too.
It's never just one thing, is it?
Nope, never that simple. Now, Marin uses a pretty interesting analogy.
What's that?
He compares it to a house seller who's holding firm on their price.
Sticking to their guns.
Exactly. And he argues that exporting nations that really rely on the U.S. market will probably have to bear the cost of these tariffs.
They'll have to lower their prices or adjust their currency.
That's the idea, yeah. So while he admits there might be some short-term price increases for American consumers, he's focused on the long-term benefits.
The big picture.
Right. He wants to create a fairer American economy.
Make America great again.
Exactly. And he believes those tax cuts and deregulation will help keep inflation in check.
So a much more optimistic outlook than Boyle.
Definitely, yeah. Now, let's get a more basic explanation of tariffs from Clear Value Tax on YouTube.
Back to basics.
Right. They start by highlighting Trump's strong pro-tariff stance, calling them a key to economic salvation.
A silver bullet.
Kind of, yeah. And they provide a really simple definition of a tariff.
What is it in a nutshell?
It's a tax on imported goods.
Plain and simple.
Exactly. They use the example of a Toyota Camry.
A classic car.
And they show how a 10% tariff would increase the price of importing that car.
So that extra cost gets added on.
It does, yeah. Now, they explain that the intended purpose of tariffs is twofold.
Two birds, one stone.
Right. First, they're supposed to make domestically produced goods more competitive.
So American-made products look better.
Exactly. And second, they're supposed to encourage foreign companies to invest in U.S.-based production.
So they avoid those import taxes.
Exactly. They even mentioned Charlie Kirk claiming that tariffs on pickup trucks led Toyota to build them in America.
Bringing jobs back to America.
That's the idea, yeah. Now, Clear Value Tax then lists the theoretical benefits of tariffs.
What are they hoping to achieve?
Well, they talk about increased domestic production, job creation, a boost to the national economy, and more government revenue.
Sounds good on paper.
It does, yeah. But then they immediately address the potential costs, the big one being inflation.
That's the worry, isn't it? Higher prices.
It is, yeah. If imported goods become more expensive because of those tariffs, consumers end up paying more for all sorts of things.
Makes sense that cost gets passed down.
It does, yeah. And they use this concept of competitive advantage.
What's that?
Well, some countries just naturally have advantages in certain industries, maybe because of lower labor costs or fewer regulations.
Makes it cheaper to produce things there.
Exactly. And they point out that a huge percentage of clothing sold in the U.S., something like 97%, and a big chunk of Walmart's goods, around 70%, are imported.
Because it's cheaper to make them overseas.
Exactly. They even give the example of Bangladesh, where labor costs are way lower.
So that's why those made-in labels are all over the place.
It is, yeah. Now, they make a really important clarification.
What's that?
Despite all the talk about foreign countries paying tariffs, it's usually the U.S. importer who foots the bill.
So American companies pay up.
Right. And they give the example of Walmart importing a vacuum cleaner.
So Walmart pays the tariff,
Mm.
and then we pay Walmart a higher price.
Basically, yeah. Now, Clear Value Tax estimates that a 10% tariff on all imports could bring in around $400 billion a year.
$400 billion. That's a lot of cash.
It is, yeah. But they also point out that the government is much bigger now than it used to be.
So even $400 billion might not be enough.
Exactly. Now, they acknowledge that those smaller tariffs during Trump's first term didn't cause massive inflation.
So maybe it's not a big deal?
Maybe not, but they also point out that a 10% tariff on everything would be a whole different story.
A much bigger impact.
For sure. Now, their overall assessment is that a 10% tariff on all imports is probably unlikely.
So maybe not a doomsday scenario.
Hopefully not, no. But they think more targeted tariffs on China are pretty likely.
Back to that trade war.
It seems that way, yeah. And they also discuss the possibility of Trump backtracking on these proposals.
He's changed his mind before.
He has, yeah. And they mentioned that Congress could try to block those tariff hikes, too.
So a lot of moving parts.
Definitely. So Clear Value Tax provides a more grounded, less politically charged explanation of tariffs.
Just the facts.
Exactly. Now, let's wrap things up with Money and Macro's analysis of what they call the MAGA Master Plan.
MAGA Master Plan. That sounds intriguing.
It is, yeah. They suggest that Trump's seemingly chaotic approach to tariffs might be part of a bigger strategy.
A grand plan.
Right. And they think the goal is to completely reshape the global economic order with the U.S. at the center.
America first, taken to a whole new level.
Kind of, yeah. And they point to figures like Scott Bessent and Stephen Miran as key architects of this vision.
Who are they?
Well, Bessent is a former advisor to George Soros, and some people think he might become Treasury Secretary.
A big player.
He is, yeah. And Miran, we just heard from him, he's that White House advisor who's written a book about restructuring global trade.
So these guys have been thinking about this for a while.
They have, yeah. And according to Money and Macro, their big concern is the decline of American manufacturing.
Those lost factory jobs.
Right. And they worry about what that means for our national security, echoing concerns from folks like J.D. Vance about shipbuilding.
So they see a link between economic strength and national security.
Definitely, yeah. Now, to understand this master plan, they give a little history lesson about the U.S.-led global order.
Take us back in time.
Okay, so after World War II, we had the Bretton Woods system.
Bretton Woods. That rings a bell.
Yeah, it basically established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency.
For everyone wanted dollars.
Pretty much, yeah. And then in the 70s and 80s, we transitioned to the neoliberal era, which was still built on that dollar dominance.
Free trade, globalization, all that.
Right, yeah. And they also bring up this thing called the Triffin dilemma.
Triffin dilemma. What's that all about?
Well, it basically describes the tension that comes with having your national currency as the global reserve currency.
Sounds like a problem.
It can be, yeah. So to keep up with global trade, you have to keep printing more dollars.
More dollars in circulation.
Right. But if you print too many, it can weaken the dollar's value.
So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Kind of, yeah. And Money and Macro argues that this neoliberal order, while it did boost global trade, also encouraged countries to hoard dollars.
To build up their reserves.
Exactly. And they say this contributed to the decline of American manufacturing and rising inequality in the U.S.
They call it the China shock.
Right. So that brings us to the 3 steps of this alleged MAGA master plan.
Okay, lay it on us.
Step 1 is what they call tariff chaos, which is what we're seeing now.
All those tariffs flying around.
Exactly. They see it as a way to gain leverage in negotiations.
Creating a bit of chaos to get what you want.
Kind of, yeah. Then step 2 is reciprocal tariffs.
Matching those tariffs, right?
Right. The idea is to level the playing field, and they suggest it could lead to currency agreements to stabilize exchange rates.
So some order out of the chaos.
Exactly. And then the final, most ambitious step is what they call the Mar-a-Lago Accord.
Mar-a-Lago Accord. That sounds very Trumpian.
It does, yeah. They imagine a new global currency agreement, kind of like a new Bretton Woods.
Reshaping the global financial system.
Exactly. And in this scenario, countries that are friendly with the U.S. would peg their currencies to the dollar.
So the dollar stays on top.
Right. And in exchange, they'd get access to markets and security guarantees, maybe even paying for it, like a kind of tribute.
A system of vassal states.
It's a pretty radical idea.
It is.
Yeah.
But do they think it's actually going to happen?
Well, Money and Macro ends their analysis with a healthy dose of skepticism.
They're not convinced.
Not really, no. They question whether other countries would willingly become economically subordinate to the U.S.
Giving up that much control.
Right. And they also point out the tension between wanting the dollar to be the global reserve currency and trying to bring back American manufacturing.
It's tough to have it both ways.
It is. So that's the MAGA master plan, a pretty ambitious and controversial vision of a potential future global order.
A lot to unpack there.
Definitely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into tariffs, it's clear there are a lot of different perspectives.
No easy answers.
Nope. We've heard arguments for tariffs as a tool in an economic war, as a flawed negotiating tactic, as a way to protect jobs, as a source of revenue, and even as a way to reshape the entire global economic landscape.
Mind-boggling.
It is, yeah. And what really stands out is that nobody seems to know for sure what the short-term and long-term effects will be.
The future is uncertain.
It is, yeah. Will we see widespread inflation? Will the markets keep freaking out? Will manufacturing jobs come back to the U.S.? These are all open questions.
Questions for the ages.
For sure. So that brings us to our final thought for you today. After hearing all these different viewpoints, what do you think the ultimate impact of these tariff policies will be on the future of global trade?
It's a big question, but one worth pondering.
It is. And beyond the immediate economic impacts, what broader shifts might we see in international relations and the balance of power around the world?
The ripple effects are far-reaching.
They are. So take some time to think about these complex issues. And if you found this deep dive into tariffs helpful, please like and subscribe to the deep dive for more AI-driven analyses of important current events.
We appreciate your support.
We do. And as always, if you want to help us keep this podcast going, you can find a link to our GoFundMe page in the show notes.
Every little bit helps.
It does. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.
Stay curious.